What's up, guys? Bert and Wesker here, the only Wesker man that is actually the mastermind IRL, and look at those bots go. Now, it's been a long time since I first discovered how to hug tech. Back in February, I think it was, when I made that original video talking about how I discovered it and how to do it, and things have changed a lot since then. It's become pretty outdated, that video, and every single hug tech guide that anybody's made since is basically just a rephrasing of my original explanation, my original understanding, which, of course, is flawed. So I thought now would be a great time to update it. Now, what a hug tech is, like default base game, is moving parallel to a wall, and then 1 to 3 frames before touching the wall and having your trigger bound prompt disappearing, you click the button to bound, which is very hard to do, because a 1 to 3 frame window is an extremely short period of time. But there is some good news, because the higher your frame rate, the easier it is to hug tech. And by easier, I mean significantly easier. Like, so easy, I think anybody can hug tech at 120. The window of time goes from about 3 frames at 60 to about 9 to 10 frames, I believe, at 120, which is equivalent to about 5 frames at 60 FPS, which is very generous, actually. It's extremely easy to hug tech at 120, but there is a downside. If I were to say hug tech this car on 120 FPS, you'll notice my first dash barely passes over the hood. My second dash ends up about right here. But if I were to hug tech the same car at 60 FPS, my first dash literally goes about halfway across the car. Instead of ending right here, I go all the way over here. And if I use my second dash, I end up past this sign. On 120, I ended up about right here, and on 60, I go all the way out here. Now, this is a pretty significant difference, actually, and that's because Wesker's acceleration is different depending on your frame rate. And what this means is that it's easier to actually perform a hug tech because he accelerates slower. Because Wesker accelerates slower, it's easier to get stuck on a wall during the acceleration, the startup of your bound. But this also means you move slower during a hug tech. So basically what this means is the higher FPS you set your game to, the slower your hug techs will be, the less distance you will get out of them, but they are significantly easier to perform. And vice versa, of course, the lower FPS you have, the harder it is to actually hug tech, but the better they are. They'll be faster, and you'll travel further. So because of this, I actually recommend, if you can, setting your in-game FPS to 90. It's a fantastic middle ground between 60 and 120. Or you can do what I do. I personally use NVIDIA Control Panel to set a max FPS of 72 for my game. I would recommend 72 FPS or 90 FPS. I think both are great middle grounds. 72 is a bit harder than 90 to actually hit the hug tech, but it prioritizes, the speed of lower FPSs while still being, easier than 60. And another reason I wouldn't recommend 60 is because there are actually some hug techs that are straight up impossible. Like, there are angles that are so extreme that it's just, if you try to hug tech from this angle at 60, it'll be next to impossible. It's already hard enough on 72. Here's a demonstration of 90 FPS and why I think it's pretty damn good. As you can see, compared to 60, the first dash was pretty much the same as 60. With the 60 I got right here, 90 I got like right here, but 120 was significantly worse. Significantly worse. And with the second dash, of course, I got about right here with 120, right here with 90, and right here with 60. It's minor differences, but I will say it is enough to make, in my opinion, playing on 120 FPS as Wesker not really worth it. I would recommend setting yourself to 90 or doing what I do, setting yourself to 72 if you really value that speed and if you're willing to get used to the hug tech timing. But none of that really matters if you don't actually know the hug tech timing. So how do you learn it? Well, one tip I have heard quite a bit is to go into your graphics settings, set your in-game HUD scale to 100%, and then what you want to do is use the charge bar and line it up with the wall that you want to hug tech. Now, if you'll notice, the trigger bound prompt disappears like basically when my charge bar touches the wall here. So what you want to do is just walk into it, and then the second you see visually the charge bar hit the car, that's when you click the button. Now, it doesn't really work as well on cars because they're a bit rounded, but on like flat walls, I've heard this helps a lot of people get to know the timing, right? I personally don't ever do this. Yeah, see, right as the charge bar like touches the back of this car, that's when the prompt disappears. So I'm going to move into it and try to time it via the charge bar. I never do this, so this is very awkward for me. And there are a couple downsides to doing this. First of all, you can't do it in the second bound because you don't have a charge bar. And second of all, it's a bit weird doing it from right to left because you have to judge based on like the little Wesker icon right there. I've heard some people say that they judge based on his head. And again, depending on the type of collision, it can also vary. So I don't personally love this method, but it is something people have used. People have told me helps them a lot. And if it helps you, I would recommend trying it. Another downside is that you have to use 100% UI scale, which I think just does not really look good. Now, here's me using the charge bar technique on an actually flat wall. It is much easier, of course. It works a lot better than on cars, but this new method that I'm showing off in this video is just so much easier than the charge bar alignment. I don't think there's any real reason to do it. Now, what you want to do is walk right up against the wall, of course, you know, perpendicular 90-degree angle facing towards it, pull up your power, go to the corner until the trigger bound prompt appears, take one step back towards the wall until it disappears, the exact spot where it disappears, and now you'll notice if I face even a little bit away from the wall now, the trigger bound prompt will reappear. This is how we're going to hug tech. Now what you want to do is move a bit past the corner, just a bit. And if you move back towards the wall, just holding to the right, not holding back, just right. I'm just holding the D key. You'll notice I round the corner. The game will push me backwards and around the corner. So what you want to do in order to hug tech is as you feel your character round the corner, you're going to flick to the left and click at the same time. Or if you're hug teching from the right, you're going to flick to the right, obviously. So again, you approach the corner. As you feel yourself round the corner, flick to the left and click. Okay? That motion right there. Approach the wall, hit the corner, flick, and click. Right? Just like that. Okay? This is much easier than timing hug techs manually. You can still mess it up, of course. It's not 100% guaranteed. But it is much, much easier and much more consistent. But that doesn't mean there's no downsides at all. If I were to hug tech this side of the pallet gym, normally, manually, just timing it, you know, facing perfectly perpendicular to the wall, this is what happens. As you can see, I move past the corner right here, and I can actually hit a survivor who is over here. But if I were to use the click and flick method, what might happen is I get stuck in this corner. Now, the reason for this is because Wesker's momentum is always being carried. His velocity is locked in the second he starts a bound. So when you're flicking to the left like this, you're bounding in this direction. You're bounding in this direction, but misplacing yourself right here, which means you get caught in this corner. Whereas if I time this manually, facing perpendicular to the wall, I have momentum this way, I have velocity this way, and I'm misplacing myself here. And if I do that, you'll see, even if I'm walking, I will glide along the wall and reach my actual wanted destination. Another spot where it might affect you if you do the click and flick is this 4-lane. If you hug tech this normally, if you hug tech this normally, perpendicularly, manually, you will glide along this box. Like that. But, of course, if you did the click and flick method, you could end up stuck on the box. It's not a surefire thing. It's not always going to happen, but it can. So it is always better to manually do it, but if you're in a situation where you can do the click and flick, and again, like I said, at that time it worked. It's not always guaranteed, but it can sometimes mess you up. But it is so much easier and so much more consistent than just normally hug tacking. You can even do it on trees. Right? If I could get this. Trees are still hard, okay? They're not easy. But I almost clipped that bot right there doing it. Now, another big reason why this might not always be optimal is because of the way Wesker's power works. Wesker's collision, if you didn't know, is predetermined. When you are holding up your power, you can basically imagine like you're playing artist and you're holding up a bird, right? There is a path in front of you calculating how far your bound will go. And Wesker is just going to bump at the end of it. If I aim right here, I will bump into these boxes. If I dash and then I teleported like over here where there's nothing, I would still bump into those boxes over there. If I were to dash right here, again, I bump into these boxes, right? If I were to dash right here, and the instant I dashed, the instant I pressed the button, I just somehow teleported right here, I'd still bump. I'd still bump. This is basically what hug teching is. This isn't the best example, but let's take a spot like this. If I were to hug tech normally, facing like right here, doing it manually, I'm not going to bump during my hug. This is because I am facing right here. My dash is going this way, and I am misplacing myself right here. So I'm not going to bump into anything. But theoretically, if I were to do the click and flick method of hug teching, I could angle my bound so that I bump into this stump. Now that realistically wouldn't happen because it's such an extreme angle that you wouldn't even hug tech here anyways. That would be a moonbound. You'd start going this way and then it'd shoot you back out. I can show that, I suppose. Like that. But let's say it were a bit closer. By doing the click and flick and not manually positioning my bound path, I would bump. Now I have like a really shitty graphic here, actually, that I could use now that I think about it. We're going to pretend this right here is our bound path, right? Look at that. This is the game calculating where we're going to bump, right? So if I'm facing over here and I hug tech over here, I'm going to bump because the line intersected with something, right? If I hug tech facing this way, I'm not going to bump because my original bound path is going right down here perfectly clear, so I'm not going to bump when I go across here. If you do the click and flick hug tech, you have less control. Here's a better example, actually. If I just hug tech normally, right here, I have nothing in my way. I'm not going to bump into anything. But if I do the click and flick, I could cause myself to bump into these rocks. I could actually try that right there. And see, if that was my second bound, I would have bumped. See? Like that. See, I'm doing the click and flick, and I'm causing myself to bump into these rocks. When normally, if I time it manually, I wouldn't. So, this is something you really gotta just keep in mind while hug teching at all times. This isn't the best overlay to show it. It isn't the best graphic, I know. But it's to give you an idea. Like, if I were to hug tech right here, I immediately bump, right? I immediately bump on this wall right in front of me. Because what the game is doing, the second I press the button, it's calculating my path, right? It's calculating my path. It's like, oh, you're going to end right there, right? And then I'm moving along this way. Okay? Or like this. There's boxes right over there, right? And so if I dash this way, I'm gonna bump with my second dash on these boxes. Here's a situation where the click flick would actually help me because it could aim away. But either way, it's still better to just see. I'm gonna bump right there. Either way, it's better to just manually time it and make sure your angle is correct first instead of just guessing, right? Because I could just manually angle this way and hug tech like that. See? So when hug teching, this is something to keep in mind. If I wanted to hug tech this car, for example, I'll bring up the graphic again, right? This silly little thing. Okay, I gotta make it the perfect size, of course. I need it to be perfect. Okay, bring up this. What's gonna happen? I'm gonna bump in that wall right there. So I'm gonna aim at this, and then I'm gonna hug tech and bump like right here. Because my bound duration is predetermined. So, when looking for hug techs, the most important thing is to look in front of you. Look where you're facing. If I'm going to hug tech this, I'm going to bump that chest, right? I'm going to bump that chest if I use my second dash. But if I hug tech from this side, I won't, because there's nothing right there. So, when setting up hug techs, you have to be aware of both collision, your environment, and any objects that are in your way. Like if I want to hug tech right here, there's a tire. But if I hug tech from this side, there's nothing. So again, instead of hug teching from this side, I can try to mind game the survivor so that I can hug tech from this side instead. And vice versa. If I want to hug tech this side of the car, I should try to go from left to right instead of right to left. Here is a great little display of this, skinny Bert logic. That's what it's called. And where it can be useful. If you want to hug tech the back of Shack, you need the basement to be there. Because if the basement is not there, you bump right here. Like that. See? But if the basement is here, you can aim your bound path down the stairs to get the distance you need to hug tech around it, like this. Let's see if I can actually get it right. I might mess it up. See? I don't bump because my bound path is traveling down the stairs, and then I am misplacing myself. I'm moving I'm moving myself, but your bound path always stays in the same spot the second you click the button. Now, of course, the most important thing about hug teching is learning the timing, of course, which you can do it manually, of course, by just moving parallel to the wall and clicking in time. Or, of course, you can do the click and flick method that I showed, if that helps. Or you can use the UI method, or maybe figure out your own special, unique way of doing it. And the second most important thing is always to keep your bound path in mind. This is also why stuff like this works, by the way. As you can see, my bound path is going in between these two objects right here, but my actual model is bumping off of this pole and sliding along the car. That's called a wall slide, and like, I guess the bound logic, the system behind it, we called Skinny Bert because it's funny. Now, an important thing to keep in mind while hug teching is the look angle of where you're hug teching from. This will change how fast your hug tech is. If you want a faster hug tech, you need to look as parallel, like as perpendicular, rather, to the object you're hug teching as possible. If I face at like a perfect 90-degree angle to the object, I'm going to end up right here, of course. But if I angle a bit out like this, what'll happen is I get much less distance. And this is because, this is why I'm showing the overlay, my velocity, the direction that the game is pushing me in, is always the same as soon as I start the bound. So if I'm hug teching right here, I'm always going to be pushed in this direction, so I'm going to go much slower along the wall. Even if I turn to the left or the right during the bound, it doesn't change anything. And if you hold movement keys, it doesn't change anything. All that matters is the initial angle. So if you want a faster hug tech, look closer to the object, like more into the object. And if you want a slower hug tech, look away from the object. And if you look far enough away from the object, what'll happen is this. That is called a moonbound, and it's named after Blight's Moon Rush because it's basically the same thing, where you hug tech, you start a hug tech, and then halfway through it, you launch yourself out the opposite way where you came from. And the reason, of course, is because I'm facing like all the way out here, and I'm getting myself caught in a wall, and eventually, like, the wall is just not enough to stop my initial velocity from overpowering it and pushing me back the opposite way. I mentioned it earlier, but that's a moonbound. There's two ways to moonbound. There's just doing a really difficult angle. It's much harder to moonbound than it is to hug tech, because it's hug teching from such an extreme angle. But there is an easier way, and it's just by using collision. Collision like this, where if I go from the right to the left, I can't actually travel over this without moving backwards a bit. I'll get caught on this during my bound, and it'll just force me back out. Because I still have velocity. The game is still pushing me forwards at all times during my bound. So when it gets caught in this corner, it's just gonna push me backwards. It's gonna like spit me back out. So you can moonbound with collision like this, just corners you can get stuck on, or by angling it like that, like really, really far away from the loop. But that is much harder. Now, moonbounds are basically exclusively used as a mind game. If you've hug teched a survivor already in a chase and they know about it, you can use a moonbound as a mind game. Like if you hug tech this right here and they're at the pallet, they can be aware of that and they'll move, counterclockwise right here and avoid your dash. But you can moonbound instead to kind of mind game them a bit. Like, they'll see you start a hug tech for just a split second, and that might make them hesitate and allow you to hit them. Now, the final term you might have heard about when it comes to hug teching is Scootslides, which is a tech where you use your movement keys and your camera to change where you end up after a bound. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to this tech, a lot of misunderstandings, and you might think I'm contradicting myself because I just said earlier your movement keys and your camera have no effect. But that's true. They do not change where you end up after a bound at all. Like, if I hug tech this, I'm going to end up right here no matter what movement keys I press or, like, where I turn my camera. All that matters when hug teching is your initial angle, like your initial bound path, where you're looking, because that's where your velocity is going to push you the entire time. So if I angle a hug tech like this, I'm going to end up right here every time. If I angle it further out, I'm going to end up like right here every time. It doesn't matter which directional keys I press or where I look with my camera, I'm going to end up in the same spot every time. But what scoot sliding is transitioning your first bound into your chain bound window smoothly. It's just understanding how to do that, really. If I want to hug tag this, I'm going to end up right here, right? If I want to like hit somebody at the pallet and I hug tech this, I end up right here and then I have to move into the pallet. But if instead I hug tech and turn like slightly to the right and hold to the left the entire time, what'll happen is I end up a bit further out. And that's because I'm holding a movement key, and the second I get into my chainbound window, I'm instantly traveling in that direction. And of course, Wesker doesn't instantly decelerate from his like top speed down to his chainbound window speed. So by holding a movement key the entire time during a bound, you don't change where the bound itself ends up, but you change how fast your movement shifts into the chainbound window. And so if I want to end up closer to the pallet, it's much easier to just hold the direction I want by moving. Like I want to go in this direction, right? So I have to move my camera and hold left. On console, it doesn't really matter where your camera is positioned because you actually have analog controls. But on PC, this is pretty good to know. Let's say a survivor is on the other side of the loop, right here, this loop right here, and I want to get an angle on them. If I hug tech normally, like I hug tech and then I stop pressing the movement keys and then start back up again, it's just, there's a little hesitation right there. Obviously, I'm exaggerating it a bit. Normally, you would start moving a bit earlier than that, but there is going to be like a little pause if you let go of the movement key and then start back up. But if I like turn during my dash and hold down back like that, I'm going to just instantly be in a better position. I don't have to like transition my brain from like inbound hug tech mode into like chainbound window mode. It just smooths the transition over, you know? It's not really a tech so much as it is just efficient movement, I guess. Like, obviously, holding a direction the entire bound is not necessary because it won't change the distance of the bound or where it ends up, but holding it the entire time will transition you into the chainbound window more smoothly. So it's again, it's not really much of a tech. It's just good movement, but still, it is really good to know. I'm not gonna deny that. It's definitely useful. But a lot of people think it changes where your bound will end up, but that's not true. That's not true. If you try to scooty slide during a bound, it's not going to get you a hit that you wouldn't otherwise. All it does is set up for your second bound. It doesn't even work if you're on your second dash or if you're on your first dash without a second token. It's just a way to more smoothly transition into the chainbound window. So that was everything you need to know about hug teching on Wesker, how it works, the mechanics behind it, and how to do it. Again, a reminder from the first part of the video, the higher FPS you have, the easier it is to hug tech, but of course, the slower it is. And again, I do recommend 90 or 72. I hope this guide was helpful to you. I hope they fix the bots just AFKing, because this makes it really annoying to record. They just AFK in the corner of the map, just constantly. Like, I don't even know why. But yeah, I hope this helps you learn how to hug tech. I hope you go do it in your own games, go practice it. Tell me if the click and flick method works for you, or if you like using the UI, or if you just time it manually. Let me know if this helps you. Thank you so much for watching. Sub for more Wesker guides and content. Follow me on twitch.tv/alranacant if you want to see me, play Wesker live, and I hope you have a wonderful day.